Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th week in our course on drugs and behavior. This week, we'll talk about another popular drug, another naturally occurring drug, and that is marijuana. And of course, here in Colorado, it is a very hot topic. Without further ado, what we're going to do is look at marijuana, and as usual, especially for our naturally occurring drugs, we'll look at the history of the drug. We'll also look at how the drug affects the brain. Because this is a course on drugs and behavior, as always, behavior is mediated through the brain. And so we'll look at how marijuana and its component parts affect the brain. Marijuana has a variety of chemicals that are psychoactive. And of course, the brain is something we've already covered in a fair amount of detail, and we actually don't know as much uh, about all the effects that marijuana has because it has all these different parts to it, all these different chemicals that make it up. And of course, there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of uncertainty about chronic use and what chronic use of marijuana does to an individual. So there are some effects that have been discredited that were thought to be negative effects of marijuana that turn out not to be the case, but there are also effects, both positive, negative, that until recently were sort of undiscovered. So we'll talk about that as well. And in this session, we're going to go over the historical aspects of marijuana, both in terms of ancient history and somewhat more recent regulation. And we'll look at the different active components, of which there's one major one that's the most famous, but it turns out, and this is important for our discussion of medical marijuana, that there are other components as well. We'll also talk about how marijuana is used in this session and what the different sort of types of marijuana are. That is, different processes that lead to different potencies for the drug. So first, let's talk about last week's discussion questions. So one question was about pregnancy and drug use, and whether drug use during pregnancy for certain substances should be subject to criminal penalties. The idea being that by engaging in this behavior, the woman is harming another person, i.e. the fetus. Uh, and this is true of a number of drugs. Last week we were talking about tobacco, but it's also true of alcohol, certain other drugs. So the question is whether this should count as criminal behavior. And of course, at the center of this debate is whether the fetus counts legally as a person. And this is at the center of not just this debate, but debates about abortion and other healthcare issues. So we're not going to resolve that here. But there are some things that are particular to this topic that are worth discussing. And one is the fact that many times a person becomes pregnant and is not aware that she's pregnant for quite a while. So she may engage in drug use and not be aware of the pregnancy, and therefore, if this law were implemented, run afoul of that law without knowledge of having committed a crime. And there are many criminal statutes where awareness of committing a crime is an important factor. That they say ignorance of the law is no excuse, but awareness of committing a crime often is a factor in the decision whether to mitigate the punishment or whether to do away with it altogether. And so that becomes an important issue to consider. Also, the degree to which resources should be put toward penalization, punishment, or education. And so this is true not just of this issue with pregnancy, but of drug use in general. This is a big debate whether we should focus our attention on punishing those who break drug laws or on a more preventative approach and focus on education. So certainly in this course, we are now aware of the harm that certain drugs can do to a developing fetus. Not everyone is aware of that. And manufacturers of various drugs, certainly alcohol and tobacco, have been better in recent years about making that more available information to the public. But again, the degree of penalization is an ongoing debate for lots of forms of drug use. So should we severely punish those who use marijuana or who use crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine? So the assignment of penalties, even if an act is deemed illegal, the assignment of penalties is still, in and of itself, a tricky issue. And of course, both penalization and education cost money, cost resources. And so we have to make decisions about how much to put in either of those domains. Also, a word on unintended or unwanted consequences. So many times when we implement a law, the goal of the law is to diminish the behavior or to prevent harm. Uh, in this case, this is certainly a valid example of a situation where implementing a law that criminalizes behavior may have unwanted downstream consequences. So if we criminalize drug use during pregnancy, that could decrease the willingness of pregnant women to seek regular health care, prenatal checkups, because they're afraid of testing positive for drugs and afraid of being arrested or punished in some way for drug use. And so if that persuades a pregnant woman not to go seek medical care when it's needed or just for regular checkups, that behavior may do harm to the fetus as well. So there obviously is not a perfect solution. And we have to weigh, and this may just be a matter of research and study, weigh the harm done by drug use against the additional harm that may be done by those that avoid the healthcare system if drug use is criminalized in this context. Okay, the other question was about secondhand smoke. And there are a couple of interesting issues here as well. So the question of whether secondhand smoke and side stream smoke in particular should be criminalized. And one big distinction here is the difference between public spaces and private homes. And of course, smoking in public is illegal already in many contexts. Smoking in private homes is not. And the question is whether that is a distinction we should keep, whether smoking should be banned in private homes as well. We'll get to the legality of tobacco here in a second. But what I mean by this is certainly what people do in their private residences is under less scrutiny and under less legal regulation than public behavior. However, as we just talked about in our previous question, there are questions of harm, unintended harm to other individuals. So maybe not a fetus in this case, but if there are children in the home, is the adult still totally free to smoke in their own home? Do we need to consider legal protections for individuals that cannot leave the home, like children? And so that's an important question, and it's one that hasn't gotten much debate really. But especially in light of the previous question, if we're willing to punish those for harming a fetus, should we not be willing to punish those for harming a child in their own home? So, important question. And of course, one idea is to make tobacco illegal in general. And here we're fighting inertia, of course. Tobacco has a big presence in our culture. It's been on the decline, but still there are so many smokers and so many users of other forms of tobacco that making tobacco illegal, especially for the number of people that are already addicted, might not be practical. But is it a long-term goal worth considering? So, for example, the scheduling of drugs. Now, this is a topic we'll get to in this week's unit on marijuana. Many people think that marijuana should not be on Schedule 1. Schedule 1 suggests that if a drug is not medically useful, if it has the high risk for abuse and harm, that it should be on Schedule 1. Now, marijuana, we're increasingly seeing, has medical uses, and its harm is relatively low compared to other drugs. Now let's look at tobacco. Tobacco costs a huge number of lives. Certainly the short-term likelihood of overdose is low, but the long-term consequences of tobacco dependence are quite costly. It's one of the most costly drugs in terms of economic, healthcare, social costs, and so that represents, and of course tobacco is highly addictive as well, so there's a real potential for abuse, and there are real harmful consequences to tobacco use. There are no accepted medical uses for tobacco. So under our definition of Schedule 1, it sounds kind of like tobacco should be on Schedule 1 and marijuana shouldn't. And schedules do get revised in terms of which drugs are on which schedule. So this is another question. Should tobacco be legal or should it be unscheduled at all? Maybe it should be on Schedule 1. So open question. So good discussion this week. For this coming week on marijuana, I will rotate the discussion groups again. So just be aware that you'll have new group members for this coming week. Okay, moving on. So marijuana is started off being a slang term. It's officially recognized now, but up until the 30s, marijuana was a slang term for what is known as cannabis. So cannabis is a plant. It's a naturally occurring substance, and here we see three different varieties of cannabis plants. The one that grows the tallest is Cannabis sativa, but there's also Cannabis indica and Cannabis ruderalis. Now ruderalis grows mainly in Russia. It's not as common, it's not as useful, and it's not as commonly harvested for its psychoactive properties. So we're not going to talk about that one as much. Sativa and indica are both grown for their medicinal and their psychoactive properties. So those are the three varieties, and early legislation really only mentioned sativa, so that early on that was a issue, was which forms of cannabis are illegal, because the laws just mentioned one of these species by name, and so it was sometimes argued that growing indica was not illegal. Of course, once you harvest them and dry them out, then it's really hard, especially with older technology, to distinguish one from the other. And this is a plant, a variety of plants that are native to Central Asia and India. So that's where they were discovered first. Of course, they spread after that. But they're not just used as psychoactive drugs. They're also used sort of industrially. So hemp is the fiber, particularly from the sativa plant, that's made from the stems. And this is a useful product, but not, outside of its psychoactive content and its medicinal content, hemp is used to make rope, to make cloth, to make paper. We'll come back to that in a second. So it's, again, this brings up a more complex issue of a plant, a substance that provides both a psychoactive drug that governments want to control, but also this industrially useful product. So how do we deal with that? And its psychoactive properties have been known for at least 2,000 years. There's some inconsistency in the literature exactly how long it's been around, how long its properties have been known. But China and India, cultures in those countries, in those present-day countries, are thought to have been the first ones to discover the medicinal and the psychoactive properties of cannabis. And its use in religious ceremonies has been around for hundreds of years. Its recreational use didn't really spread to Europe until about 1800. It was known in the Middle East around the year 1000. Took a little longer for recreational use in the form of hashish to spread to Europe. But nevertheless, it got there, and of course, from there, it went on to the Americas. So more recent history, talking about the early 20th century, we've already gone over some of this. So in 1930, we know from our unit on regulation of drugs, there was the Bureau of Narcotics. So this was founded in 1930, and of course this individual on the right, Henry Anslinger, was the director of this bureau from 1931 and for several decades after that. And of course he had sort of a personal crusade against marijuana and the use of marijuana. And he was instrumental in advocating for and getting passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And as with many of the pieces of legislation in the early 20th century, this was more of an economic measure. It was designed, of course, to diminish marijuana use, but it was doing so by taxation. This was later repealed in the late 60s because it was deemed unconstitutional. There's a law, the Fifth Amendment, against making someone incriminate themselves for a criminal act. But by acknowledging that one had to pay this tax effectively, that was ruled as being self-incriminating, and you can't legally require people to incriminate themselves for crimes. So you can't have a product that is both illegal and taxable. And this Marijuana Tax Act was passed and was advocated for largely on the basis of propaganda that later turned out to be untrue. So, for example, it was thought and publicly pronounced that marijuana was linked to violence, that violent crimes were being caused by marijuana use. As we'll see, this has since been dispelled. And of course, here the data were not experimentally derived, and they weren't very careful in their analysis, because using marijuana is often used in conjunction with alcohol, for example. Um, but alcohol wasn't being blamed. It was the marijuana that was blamed for criminal acts. And of course, in the early 20th century, we also saw drug regulations as a way of responding to changes in society, particularly the ethnic makeup of society. And so the Marijuana Tax Act was sort of floated out on that platform that there were minorities that were becoming increasingly frequent, that is, increasingly uh, common in the U.S., and that they were also increasingly powerful. And so the propaganda indicated that African American and Mexican American subpopulations within the U.S. were using this new drug, marijuana, um, and particularly more heavily than uh, European Americans, and that, of course, this was later viewed as a way of trying to control the behavior of minorities, and a way of sort of playing upon people's fear of minorities to get this legislation passed. Uh, but marijuana is and has been a Schedule I substance. Of course, the drug schedules weren't established in the 30s. They were established by the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was passed during the Nixon administration. And we've already talked about this as well during our unit on drug regulation. So here, the Controlled Substances Act created these drug schedules where drugs are categorized in terms of their availability and their legality based on how harmful the drug is, how likely the drug is to be abused, and if there are any medical uses for the drug. And so marijuana is a Schedule I substance, which indicates that it has a potential for abuse, that it is harmful, and that it has no accepted medical use. Of course, almost immediately this prompted movements that urged the government to reconsider this scheduling. This has been brought up again and again since the 70s. As we'll see, there are arguably some medical uses for marijuana, and it turns out that certainly its physiological dependence potential is non-existent, at least. It might be low, it depends, the debate rages on. But really, there's not much evidence for a physiological dependence, and really, the debate is more centered on psychological dependence. But at any rate, well, as we'll see, the the risk for dependence and the consequences of dependence are pretty minimal. So with that in mind, people have urged the reconsideration of Schedule 1, including marijuana. Okay, so we have marijuana, we have cannabis, this plant. So what's in it? So marijuana is not synonymous with a single substance the way that alcohol is, or the way that cocaine is. Cocaine is a natural product, but cocaine is a single chemical. Alcohol is a single chemical, even though it occurs naturally as well. Marijuana has a variety of chemicals, many of which are still being discovered. So there are many compounds that are unique to the cannabis plant, and there's some that occur in cannabis that occur elsewhere. Um, but these compounds that are unique to the cannabis plant and that share a similar chemical structure are called cannabinoids, from the word cannabis. And there are lots of cannabinoids. Marijuana itself contains more than 50 of them, but not all of them are psychoactive. And so we'll talk about the ones that are the primary psychoactive ingredients of marijuana. The most famous is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, usually just called THC. Technically, THC is a variety of compounds. Delta-9 is a very particular chemical, but for our purposes, THC refers to the main psychoactive constituent of marijuana. So here we have a chemical diagram on the right. There's also a related compound called cannabidiol, which is also found in marijuana, and also has, it's not as psychoactive, but it does have medicinal properties. It does affect the physiology of the body. And so it's recently become the subject of a lot of research because it's thought that some of the medicinal properties of marijuana actually stem from cannabidiol. You also have cannabinol, which is not the same as cannabidiol, and cannabinol occurs in small quantities in marijuana, but primarily it is what THC is metabolized into. And cannabinol itself has some physiological and some psychoactive properties. They're weaker. It's not as strong a compound as THC, but they do exist. And so, again, we see this idea of a drug being metabolized into something else that also has physiological and psychoactive properties. And it's the ratio of these different chemicals that are present in marijuana, and they're variable. So the relative concentrations of these compounds determine, A, the subjective psychoactive experience, but also the potential medical use. And so these concentrations depend on the part of the plant that's harvested, so also the type of plant. THC is more common in the flowering parts of the marijuana plant, of cannabis. The leaves don't contain much, and the stems contain very little. The male flowering parts don't contain very much either. It's really the female flowering parts that contain the most THC. And people have figured this out. They've also figured out that the time of harvest matters. So it's a naturally occurring substance. It's a plant. And so one chemical is converted into another depending on what part of the life cycle the plant is in. So when the plant is flowering, that's when it has the most THC. And it's thought that THC was evolved as a deterrent to herbivores. So it has physiological effects, and it's thought that THC was evolved by plants as a means of defending themselves. In any event, when a plant is flowering, the female flowers have the highest THC content. Once those flowers get fertilized, then that energy starts getting shunted from THC production into seed production. So a female plant that has flowers but hasn't been fertilized yet is the most potent in terms of its THC content. Also, the difference between cannabis indica and cannabis sativa also bears on the relationship, the ratio of THC to cannabidiol. So we'll talk more about that when we get into the effects of marijuana. And it's often proposed that marijuana has gotten more potent since the 1960s, that marijuana is 10 times more powerful now. So this is sort of true, but sort of misleading as well. Yes, the average dose of the average amount of marijuana consumed by an individual in the U.S. has more THC in it, but it's not really because plants themselves have become more potent. They have to a certain degree, but really it's that people consume more potent forms of marijuana than they did in the 1960s. So that is part of it. Really, it's the forms of marijuana that are consumed. There is some truth to the plants themselves having been engineered to produce more THC, but the 10 times more potent is a little misleading because A, the forms of marijuana are really what's driving it, not the amount of THC in the plant itself. Also, in the 1960s and early 1970s, the more potent forms of marijuana weren't being measured for their THC content. So we probably underestimated the potency of marijuana in the 60s and 70s, in addition to having different forms that are commonly used. So how is marijuana used? The most common form is smoking. So inhalation, we've already seen, is a very quick, a very potent way of getting psychoactive substances into the bloodstream, into the brain. One of the most common ways is through cigarette form, otherwise known as a joint. There are also water pipes, which are commonly called bongs. And these are, again, different ways of delivering smoke to the lungs. Pipes and water pipes in particular are more efficient in terms of how much of the smoke they deliver. You also have things like hookahs, which we've already seen have become more popular for tobacco use as well. But these are all just different mechanisms for combusting the marijuana and delivering the smoke, including the THC and the cannabidiol, to the lungs. There's also ingestion. So swallowing, ingesting marijuana, and then absorbing it through the stomach and the small intestine. Now, these different forms, and we already talked about how different marijuana plants have variable THC content, but these different forms do as well. And so some of these can be smoked, some are ingested. The most potent form is what's known as hash oil, which is a really pure form. It's an extract of marijuana, and this can be up to 70% in terms of volume THC. So the psychoactive component of marijuana is really purified in hash oil. There's also hashish, which has been around for hundreds of years, and that has a high content as well. It's up to 20%. And this is sort of a hard or semi-hard gelatinous or resinous compound. And so this, again, is a more purified form of the plant. You also have more recognizable plant forms like sinsemilla. Sinsemilla is from the Spanish, meaning without seeds. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the THC content of the plant is highest in the female flowers, and it's even higher in those flowers if those flowers have not been fertilized. That is, they have no seeds. So this has about an 11% THC content. It can get up to 20%, but on average, it's about 11. And then you have the leaves and the stems, those sort of the leftover parts of the marijuana plant, and these only have around 1%. This is not a commonly used form of marijuana in the U.S. But we can see from just the simple list how wide a variety of levels of THC content there are. So, the difference between taking a dose of hash oil is quite starkly contrasted against the dose in just the leaves and the stems of marijuana. And even within a particular form, as I mentioned, sinsemilla can be up to 20%, almost twice the average dosage. And this is one of the potential problems with any naturally occurring drug, is it's very hard to control what the content of the psychoactive substance is. As we'll see, marijuana is not without its problems in terms of chronic use, but one of the problems is not knowing how much of the substance is present, and therefore not knowing how much to use, whether recreationally or medicinally. So how is marijuana absorbed? So obviously if it's inhaled, it's taken up through the lungs. And here, the peak effects usually occur within 10 minutes. And on the right, we have a graph indicating the potency, the percentage on average of the peak effect experienced as a function of time. So within about 10 minutes, it usually has its full potency if it's smoked. Of course, if it's ingested, if it's swallowed, this is a longer time course. It takes about 90 minutes. Digestion is a much longer process than inhalation. It takes longer to be processed by the stomach. It takes longer to be absorbed into the blood. And once it's been absorbed into the blood and the brain, it takes quite a long time to actually eliminate. So THC itself is fat soluble. What does that mean? Well, that means it gets absorbed into the fatty tissues of the body, and it takes a lot longer for it to leach out of those tissues. If it's just in the blood, or if it's water soluble, then it's often filtered by the kidneys and processed when the blood is processed. But because it's fat soluble, it tends to stay resident in those fatty tissues for quite a while. Eventually, it gets metabolized by the liver, which of course is an organ that metabolizes a lot of different drugs. It has a half-life of about 20 hours, which means that once it's taken into the body, after 20 hours, there's about half as much THC left in the body as there was initially. And this is compared to just a couple of hours for something like alcohol. So the thing is that THC is resident in the body. It can be measured. It's difficult, which means it's hard to make a behavioral or a chemical test for things like drug intoxication. But it's hard to correlate with behavior because it stays around for so long, because it's slowly processed, because the degree of fatty tissue from one individual to another is highly variable. And so there isn't a strong correlation between the amount that can be measured in the body and the behavioral and cognitive effects we experience. So this was a discussion question a couple of weeks ago. What do we do for tests of drugs in individuals when there isn't an easy test of the blood and isn't an obvious correlation between blood content and behavior? Now, for alcohol, that's not true. We can very tightly correlate, not perfectly, but tightly correlate blood content and behavioral effect. But the hard part is with drugs like THC. And of course, as I mentioned, THC is metabolized into other compounds, cannabinol being the most notable. But A, it's hard to keep track of all these metabolites, and B, we don't know what all these metabolites do. So again, just because THC levels might be lower, that doesn't mean some of the metabolites aren't having their effects. Okay, so that will wrap it up for our first unit on marijuana. Next time, we'll continue to look at marijuana, and this time we'll look at what effects it has on the brain. So once it's in the system, once it's in the blood, what does it do to the brain? And what does that change in the brain do to behavior and to cognition, both in the short term and the long term? And then finally, we'll wrap up with the current legal status, which is, of course, a very hot topic right now. So we'll look at all of that next time, and I will see you then.